This is lecture 13B. So last time I talked about India and the sort of political situation and the rise and fall of big empires. Now I want to talk about a different thing, which is that India is really the center of Indian Ocean trade as it develops. Now we've talked, I talked quite a bit, not quite a bit, but I talked earlier about how in the classical era you started to see more ocean-bound trade, especially of spices between India and China and the Gulf of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, and then those trade networks competed with the Silk Roads. Well, beginning in the 800s, 900s, you start to see a real growth in Indian Ocean trade, ocean-going trade. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is that merchants began to really figure out the monsoon wind system. Now, monsoons are seasonal weather patterns. And essentially what happens is that Asia is this huge landmass, and it heats up in the summer when it's getting a lot of sunlight, and then when the Earth is tilted towards the sun in the northern hemisphere, you get summer in the north and winter in the south, and so it absorbs a lot of sunlight then, and this causes the whole continent to become a sort of a big oven or heat sink, and then in the winter, it of course loses that heat. And what that does is, because you have this the land getting hotter faster than the ocean, the Indian Ocean doesn't heat up that fast, what you get then is different patterns that during the year at different times, the winds will be flowing north or south depending on depending on this variation, because when the land mass is hotter, that causes hot air to rise and cold air flows north toward the landmass, and when the landmass is cooler, then the airflow reverses. So what this means in practical terms is that for about 6 months a year, the winds blow consistently north along the east coast of Africa, out of the Indian Ocean up the coast of India, and then coming up from basically Australia towards the mainland, Philippines, etc. And then for about 6 months of the year, that reverses and the winds blow south down the coast of Africa, down the coast of India, from Indonesia and Southeast Asia towards Australia, etc. And what this allows what allows merchants to do is they didn't have lateen sails at this time. Lateen sails are those triangular sails, and they allow you to tack into the wind very effectively. But most sailors at this point just had square rig sails, which are good if you have the wind behind you, but they're not very good for tacking into the wind or across the wind. And so essentially what merchants would do is they'd say, okay, the winds are blowing south for this 6 months, so they would just start from the north, from Arabia, from Egypt or Persia or somewhere in the Middle East, or from India, and they would head south, and they would travel south, and they would stop at a bunch of cities along the way, buying and selling things. And then when they got to the farthest south they were going to go, they'd sit there and wait, and they'd wait for several months until the weather shifted, and then they could take the same winds back north and repeat the trip in the other direction. And so this allowed them to have a very regular cycle of trade, always having tailwinds essentially. And so these monsoon winds also bring a regular rainy season. They bring a typhoon season, basically, just like we have the hurricane season in the southern Atlantic for similar reasons. And so essentially the monsoon winds, because they're so predictable, and they are really predictable, they allowed for these trade networks to really emerge that worked on an annual cycle. And as merchants began to figure this out, they began to really trust the monsoon winds, and then they began to put more and more money into this. I mean, being a merchant was really a catastrophically dangerous thing before the modern era with the idea of insurance, because if you're putting the equivalent of millions of dollars into a ship and it sinks in a storm, you're out your money. right? Or if say you send it to some southern port and it gets seized by the authorities there, you're out your money. Or suppose that you trade to somebody and then pirates take your stuff on the way back. It's really dangerous. So having regular monsoon winds allows merchant to say, well, that's at least something I know I can trust. That at least I can predict. I can avoid the monsoons because I know when they're coming. I can have good winds on the way down. I can have good winds on the way back. So it allowed them to minimize the risk because they had such predictable weather patterns. And once you have predictable weather patterns, you can also, and you start to trust them, you can also start to build bigger ships. And we see this with Arab shipbuilders and also with Chinese shipbuilders, that during this period, 900 to 1200 or so, ships start getting bigger and bigger. Right? And that's partly because their merchants are willing to trust more to one ship, but it's also technological innovations in hull building and things like that. But in any case, these newer ships, these bigger ships, especially the Chinese junks and your dhows and things like that in India and the Arabian territories, allowed for much more trade. So trade begins to pick up in volume, and trade begins to pick up in terms of distance and frequency. And so you really start to see this annual trade that gets bigger and bigger and bigger over the course of the centuries, between 900s roughly and 1200 or so. And we'll see that this is also driven in part by sort of increasing prosperity and stability in Europe, that they're on one end of those trading networks, and we'll see that the stability of southern India helps, and the Tang and Song dynasties help, and so you have sort of perfect conditions for the growth of trade. I'll put it that way. And this growth of trade leads to regional specializations, and I talked about this just a little bit in terms of China, but basically, what begins to happen is that instead of people saying we have to grow all of our own food and we have to produce all of our own clothes and we have to produce all of our own bricks and our tools and everything, and we have to, we eat what we produce, and then we'll trade just a little bit of luxury goods to somebody else, they began to say instead, why don't we know there's a market for what we produce, why don't we just start producing a whole lot of that, and we'll stop making all the other stuff we need. We'll just produce stuff to sell to these merchant networks, but then we'll buy everything we need from those merchant networks. And so you start to see, instead of just luxury goods and fine silks and jewels and gold work and things like that and really expensive spices being traded, you start to see instead more commodities, rice and grain and lumber. And you also start seeing less expensive fabrics, and you start to see more and more spices and incense and perfumes, and more just sort of common metal goods and things like that. And so basically, as this trade takes off, each region begins to focus on what do we do best, what can we make money with the best. And so each region begins to develop specializations in certain types of fabric or certain spices, or whatever they can do really well and they can do en masse. They start to do in really large volumes, and they count on selling all this stuff elsewhere and then buying the things that they need. So for instance, I mentioned in southern China, they gradually, if you look at the silk producing regions around southern China and Guangdong, you start to see people convert more and more to mulberry trees and to produce silk, and they produce less and less rice, but they buy rice elsewhere, right? And so what you really start to see then is regional specialization, but this means that each region is making more money, they're producing more stuff for export, but they are also more dependent on that trade because they're not producing everything they need, right? They have to buy food because they're not producing food because they're producing silk or they're producing, cotton for textile exports or something like that, right? So you begin to see this regional specialization, which leads to regional integration because people become much more interdependent, okay? Now, there's one other aspect of this new growth of trade which is really important. There's new economic tools, in particular Muslim merchants operating out of the Middle East, Persians, Arabs from the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, Egypt, that area. They begin to develop financial tools to allow long-distance trade to work better. In particular, they start to develop banks and have branches of banks, and then they develop the idea of the check, which is where you write a note that says, if you go to this bank, you get money out of our account. And this allows, rather than carrying a whole bunch of cash all the way across the ocean, now you can just carry a check all the way across the ocean. And the check isn't really very useful for, I mean, it's much easier to carry for one thing, but it's also less likely to be stolen because you can only use it at that bank. And so this allows Muslim merchants to begin to develop much more flexible financial arrangements that allow them to trade without having to actually ship gold coins everywhere. And this also increases trade because now those ships don't have to be carrying all those gold coins or commodities to trade. They can just carry, they can write checks, and they can buy and sell things that way. Helps a great deal, right? Just as a side note, also at about this time, the Italians invent double entry bookkeeping, which spreads pretty rapidly, and that also facilitates international trade. So with all this, with all these new, bigger ships, regional specialization, figuring out the monsoon winds, new financial tools, trade takes off, and it becomes a much bigger cultural influence because more and more people have their livelihoods tied up in trade. More and more people are relying on trade goods in their daily life. You start to see more and more people just are buying things that are coming from really far away, and they don't even give it a second thought because the trade has become so systematic and so consistent that they don't have to worry about it. They know they can get that stuff. Right, and so and you also see these enormous concentrations of wealth in regions that are producing things that the rest of the world wants. And China begins to get, southern China particularly, gets very wealthy because they're producing the silk and the spices that the rest of the world really wants. Right, and India becomes very wealthy because they're also producing certain spices, especially peppers, that the rest of the world desperately wants. Right. Just as a side note, pepper really is this fantastically lucrative spice to sell. And you might wonder why pepper so much. I mean, we don't use pepper that much. We're not talking about chili peppers either. Those are American. Those don't show up in Eurasia until after Columbus. We're talking about black pepper and peppercorns. But part of the reason is that this is a world without refrigeration. And pepper is actually a pungent enough spice that it can cover up the taste of meat that's starting to go bad, and et cetera. So it really becomes crucial for people if they want to eat food that's palatable. You spice the heck out of it so that you don't have to taste it if it's starting to go bad. On that happy note, India, of course, if you look at the geography of the Indian Ocean, you sort of got two separate trade networks, and India is the nexus of both of them. So on the one hand, you've got Muslim merchants, Persians and Arabs coming out of the Persian Gulf and Egypt and Syria, etc., and Iraq, and they're coming down. They're using ships coming out of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and they're traveling down the east coast of Africa. And they gradually work their way farther and farther down the east coast of Africa. And I'll talk more about that in a later lecture this week. And then they go across the Indian Ocean to India, to the west coast of India. So that's a really Muslim-dominated network. There's a second network which essentially extends from the east coast of India into Indonesia and then up into China and the Philippines. And this one, now Muslim merchants also get over there. It's not like Muslim merchants are stuck on one side of India, but there's really two separate regional networks, and India is the nexus between them. And in particular, merchants find it really helpful if you keep a bunch of warehouses in India. And you're doing this monsoon winds, you can do your trade down the coast of Africa and buy the things you want there and then bring them to India and let them sit there over the next monsoon season and then ship those out to China or the next monsoon season, etc. So India becomes really important for these trade networks because it's so central and because it's a perfect sort of stopover place, and it connects these two separate networks of trade networks that with all these ships plying the different monsoon trade wind paths. So overall, this Indian Ocean trade becomes really lucrative, and it becomes really integral for the economies of China and India and East Africa and the Middle East. They all begin to rely economically on these trade networks. And you start to see pretty wealthy kingdoms emerge also in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, etc., because those are important stopover places between China and India. And so you start to see wealth accumulating there also. So it really begins to shift a lot of the dynamics of power and wealth in the Indian Ocean basin. And we'll see much later in the course that when the Europeans show up, they essentially see that there's this established trade network and they try to take it over. And they more or less succeed in the long run. But that's a much later lecture. That's actually in History 112. So overall, India benefits enormously from this trade network. And we see that this trade network becomes much, much bigger between 900 and 1200 or so, and it starts to carry many more things that are sort of staples that people need in life, rather than just restricting itself to luxury goods. People still trade in luxury goods, but they're not solely restricted to that because these bigger ships can carry a whole lot more cargo.